Today I thought we'd run through some of the settings in the ScanNCut machine. I'm going to switch it on. You'll get the Brother logo and then the ScanNCut logo. Once you see those, you tap the screen. It will tell you that the carriage and the mat will move into its initial position if you've got a mat loaded. Say OK, and that's ready to go now. So you've got an on and off button, a home button, a settings button. This button is to load and unload your mat, and this button is to start, pause or stop your machine. I'm going to go into the settings. I've got the language set to English. We're on page 1 of 5. These arrows will let us scroll through to the next pages. I've got my measurements set on inches, but you can change to millimetres, and you can change it at any time, even with a design on the screen. The cutting area by default when you get your machine is set for a 12 by 12 mat. If you click on this, you'll see there's your 12 by 12 cutting area. You can use a 12 by 24 mat. If you click on this icon, it will show you that you're going to go onto the bigger mat, and if you say OK and OK and then go into patterns and just choose a pattern for now, any old pattern will do. It still looks like it's 12 by 12, but there's a big arrow down here, and that's telling us that we've got more of a mat to work with. So if we click on that, you can see the flowers disappeared because it's on the top half of the 12 by 24 mat, and this is the rest of the area that we can work with. And we click on that and it brings us back to the top. So if we say OK, and I want to go back now, so if I go back into my settings and then come back here and I want to go back to the 12 by 12 mat, I just select that and say OK, and that has set it back to a 12 by 12. But you may work with A4 or letter size card in the majority of the time, and you may want a more realistic view of how your designs look on that size of media. So if you come on here and click this, you can actually adjust the size of your cutting area. In the UK we tend to use A4, which I think is about 8.5 by 11. So you can use the drag handles, and as I'm dragging you'll see the size changes here. So if I drag up, the height is changing. I want to go to about 8.5. And if I drag in, I want to come to about just under 11. And say OK and OK. You can see now that because our cutting area has changed, you get a more realistic view of what this flower would look like in size once cut if you were using a smaller piece of card to start off with rather than a 12 by 12. So that's something quite useful. I'm going to go back into the settings and I'm just going to change it back to 12 by 12 because I prefer to work in that. This icon down here is how the background looks when you've done a scan, which I'll come back to in a little while. Go to page 2. This is your cut speed and cut pressure. I tend to always leave my cut speed on 5 and my pressure on 3, but that can change depending on the media I'm cutting. And again, with the draw speed and the draw pressure, mine are both left on 3. You can experiment with those yourself depending on what you are cutting or drawing. Page 3, auto shutdown. If you walk away and leave the machine on, it will shut down after a set time. I've got mine set to an hour. You can change it, but I prefer it to be left on its minimum, which is an hour. You can choose whether to have the buzzer on and off when you press the buttons. Seam allowance, I've got mine set in millimetres and the smallest is 3 milli. You can change it, and you can change it. It can go down in inches if you want to, if you prefer to see it in inches. And the pattern interval, I've got mine set at 1. That basically is just the distance between any number of pattern images that you've got on your screen. You can choose to have them spaced further apart or closer together to get the best use out of a piece of card when you're cutting multiple shapes. Page 4 is just whether you want the opening screen on or off, and page 5 shows you the serial number of your machine. So let's just go back to our mat now. If at any time you want to go back to your patterns section, you can just press the home screen and it will say, do you want to delete what's on the screen? And you say yes, and it brings you back here and you can start again. So I'm just going to go and choose that flower again. And there it is on the screen. Now if I go into this icon and click on here, I can decide if I want more of it. I only chose one originally when I set it on the screen, but I can go in and change that. So say I want 6 and say OK, and it's put 6 on. Now because I'd originally chosen one flower and then I decided to alter the number by going into this icon here and asking for 6 in total, it's put them all on top of each other like this. So if I say OK and then go to this icon, I can click this icon and it will space them out for me, and I say OK. If I'd have chosen 6 originally, they would have come in spread out differently, and I'll show you what I mean. So I can go back to the home button, I can say yes, get rid of those. I can go to pattern, go back to the flower, choose it, say OK, yes, that's the one I want. Now here, whereas originally I said 1, if I say 6 and say set, it puts them on my mat like that. So there are 2 ways of doing it, and it doesn't really matter which way you do it. So I've got 6 flowers on the screen, but really I wanted 3 to cut in card, and I wanted another 3 that were slightly bigger so that I could layer them up. So if you click on this multiple shapes icon, this icon here selects everything. I don't want that, so tap it again to unselect. What I want to do is isolate these 2 with this one down here. So if I click this and drag my arrows down, and then say OK, it's just selected those 2. I can now bring both of those down here and say OK. So I can move certain shapes that are on my screen depending on how I use those drag handles. Now I want to resize these 3 so they're slightly bigger than those. So I'm just going to deselect those so that just one is selected to get this icon highlighted again now. I'm going to select that, and I want a seam allowance on these 3, and my seam allowance at the beginning when I showed you in the settings was 3 milli. So these 3 shapes I'm going to make 3 millimeter bigger all round than those 3. So if I've got one selected, if you look at the size now, it's telling me it's 3.91 high. If I select this icon, it's made it 4.15, so it's made it 3 milli all round bigger. If I select the next one and click that, that's done the same, and that one, and that's done the same. So I've now got 3 up here, which are 3.91, and these 3 I could cut in a different layer of card and put them behind those to give me a layered effect, and we'll say OK. And by that I mean like this is the same flower, just cut at a slightly different size, but this is what I mean. So this top paper layer here would be those, and this pink bottom layer is 3 milli bigger, which would be these. So I hope that makes sense. Then if you decide, well actually I don't want all these now, so I'm going to click on that and delete it. I'm going to click on that and delete it, and that, and that. So I'm just left with one flower and one matting layer. I'm going to load my mat up and do a background scan to show you how the scanning icons in this settings section at the beginning work. I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to load up my mat and do a background scan. So I've put a piece of pink card and a piece of blue card. I'm going to load that into the machine. And I'm going to try and get a bit nearer so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to choose the background scan icon, which is this blue, and then I'm going to say OK and scan it. I've scanned my pink and blue piece of card, and I deliberately put a dark piece of card on so that I can go back into the settings and show you how the background icon changes what appears on your screen. Now I know my flowers are bigger than my card, but I'm not going to cut them. It's just to show you the functions. So if I wanted to put this flower, which is the background one, the one that was 3 mm bigger, and cut it in blue, and then cut this one in pink, so I would get something like this, only this top layer would be the pink on the screen and this bottom layer would be the blue. If I go into the setting, you can't really see this flower on here properly. If I go into the settings, and it's usually set on the first icon by default, if I now click on the second and say OK, you can see that it's made the colours lighter, so you can see the design better. And if I go back into the settings and turn it off altogether, there's nothing there at all. So I usually leave mine on the default, but if I'm using a dark card, I will swap between the two. So I hope that helps with that function for you. And then obviously all as you would do then is you would say OK and you would cut. I hope you found that helpful, and I will try and do another video at some point in the future showing the other features that are within your ScanNCut machine. Thank you.